In the text lecture right before this video, I gave you a lot of SQL to run. When you ran that SQL, it created 3 different tables. First, it recreated photos and users. They have the exact same structure as what you saw before, but it also created a new table called comments. There's nothing really too new about this comments table. It was put together pretty much as you might expect. Comments has an ID, it has contents, which is the actual text of each comment, and then it has 2 foreign key columns. One relates each comment to a user, and the other relates a comment to a photo. So in theory, this would be the user who created the comment, and the photo would be the photo that the comment was added to. We have 20 different photos, 100 different comments, and now 5 different users. So now with a more complete data set, we're going to start to write out some more complex queries. That's the big focus of this section, and it's what we're going to start to investigate over the coming videos. So now that we have a little bit more interesting data set, we're going to write out some more interesting queries. So things like maybe try to find the average number of comments per photo, or find for the photo with ID 3, get all the different comments for it, and also get the username of the person who authored the comment. We're going to answer all of these different queries using 2 really important techniques, and these 2 techniques are the big focus of these coming videos. So we're going to learn about writing queries using joins and aggregation. Let me give you a couple of notes on these 2 techniques very quickly. Okay, so first off, joins. We make use of joins in SQL queries to somehow produce a value or a set of rows by merging together a lot of different rows from different tables. We're most frequently going to reach for joins anytime you are trying to answer a question or write a query to answer a question related to multiple different kinds of resources. So for example, back on this list over here, you'll notice that the first query says, find all the comments for the photo with ID number 3, along with the username of each comment's author. So this query is mentioning comments and photos and users. Because we are mentioning multiple different types of resources, that might be a sign that we want to use a join. It's not always the case, but if you are being asked to find different kinds of resources, you might think about using a join. The other thing we're going to learn about is aggregation. The goal of aggregation is to take a set of rows or some number of rows and somehow calculate a single value out of them. Anytime you hear the words like most or average or least or greatest or something like that, that's frequently a sign that you're going to want to use some kind of aggregation technique in a query. So a lot of these different items on here mention average number of characters, average number of comments, most activity, and so on. So a lot of these queries on here are signs that we probably want to use some kind of aggregation. Okay, so that's what we're going to be focusing on in the coming videos. In just about all these videos, I'm going to be posing some kind of query or question that we want to solve. We're then going to write out a query to solve it, and then discuss exactly what the query is doing for us. So let's get to it, starting in the next video.